welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, my name's Martin, and I'm trying to make this channel to share some of my experiences now that I've retired. You join me for something a little bit different today. While I was down on the East of England rivers, or some of the East of England rivers, I encountered a number of people that had also travelled down from the canals, and obviously people that are down on the rivers cruising the whole time. And the question that was often asked is, which do you prefer? Do you prefer the canals or do you prefer the rivers? So this is my attempt to sort of, I suppose, share my experiences rather than a review. It is a personal opinion. It's not meant to criticise anything. And it's also an opinion based on the experiences of a solo boater. So, as I say, it's not meant to be critical of anything. It's not meant to show favouritism. It's just how I found it. Okay, enjoy. Well, I think for me the best way of doing this is to do a sort of pros and cons. And we'll start with the rivers. Now, the first thing you notice when you get down onto the river system, apologies if there's a lot of wind noise on the mic, but the first thing you notice when you get onto the river system is it's so wide. There is so much space, and the more you get into the system, the more you begin to recognise that there's not a lot of boat movements either, and that gives you the impression of space as well. The next thing to notice, and again quite quickly once you get onto the river, is that the moorings are all very well maintained. A majority of them are maintained by the Environment Agency, and are well surfaced. Great bollards, fencing, the vegetation's managed well. And even the, let's call them the subsidiary moorings, I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but those moorings that are managed by organisations, charities, like the Friends of the River Nene and the Great Ouse Boating Association, are also well maintained. They don't necessarily all have bollards, but the vegetation's always nicely managed. The banks are always accessible, so you can get your boat in, and once you've joined those organisations, which are not expensive, they're free. On the subject of well maintained, the locks on the system, again managed by the Environment Agency, are all in very good order. They don't leak, or they don't leak to any great degree. They're always in good condition. They're well maintained. And this might not seem, the fourth point, may not seem like a major issue, but you don't encounter a great deal of floating debris. And by that I mean, you know, I wouldn't say shopping trolleys, that's a bit of a cliche, but you know, things that are floating in the rivers, you don't encounter that very much. There's the odd log, but mostly it's not. Weed is another matter. You get on some rivers and it's quite bad for weeds. So that's the pros for the rivers. As I say, it's based on my experiences, my views, and from the perspective of a single-handed boater. So now let's have a look at the pros for canals. Well, mooring opportunities are almost limitless. Availability is not always the case, particularly when you find popular moorings or mooring sites. You might sometimes struggle to find somewhere to moor up. But as long as there's a towpath, in principle anyway, you can moor. Whether you can get near to the bank is another matter, but that's a different story. In terms of frequency, services and facilities are frequent on the canal. You're never that far away from a water point. You sometimes have to go a little bit further to find somewhere to empty the Elsan or get rid of your rubbish, but water is usually readily available at regular intervals. Something that particularly appealed to me and something that I notice is the heritage of the network, heritage of the canal system is fantastic. Pretty much every village or town that you pass through on the boat has in some way had a long connection with the canal, and that gives points of interest all the way along. Now again, I don't know if this is valid, but it's something that I got a sense of, is that communities along the canal seem to be more frequent. Whether that's because the canals by and large are based on people, as in carrying goods and commodities, or whether it's based on something else, but you don't need to travel very far before you get to the next village or the next town or the next community. And that offers opportunities if you want to stop for a beer, or you need to get a loaf of bread or some milk, or even a bigger shop. So those communities on the canals, and I found it as a positive, seem to come a bit thicker and faster. And now let's look at the other side of the coin and look at the things that I found a little less favourable, shall we say. The moorings on the river are infrequent. They might be very well maintained, but they are infrequent. So if you need to stop, either because the day's too long, or you need to stop particularly as a solo boater, you need to stop to use the loo, then you've got to wait. And you've got to wait until you get to the next mooring. And sometimes that can be quite a distance. Whereas on the canals, as I said before, you can, if you've got a towpath and you can get access to the bank, you can moor up. It's as simple as that. In a similar vein, services on the river are also infrequent. Water more so, but not by no means the same frequency as on the canal. But if you want to empty the Elsan toilet, you, by and large, you have to go into a marina to do that. And then you have to pay for it, and it's not as convenient as it is on the canal. One other thing which a lot of people might find an odd thing to say, but I found the locks on the rivers a lot less simple. Now, the locks on the canals are not in the best condition more often than not, and they leak, but I find them easier to operate and quicker to operate. The locks on the rivers, yes, the guillotine locks are by and large electric, not all of them, some of them have got a wheel, but they are so slow. And I know why. It's a safety factor, so that boats don't get trapped underneath the guillotine with inexperienced use. But the ergonomics of the whole lock, so where you get off, where you can open the paddles, where you can operate the guillotine, it requires, because you can't cross the gates on one of those locks, you have to walk around all the time, and it's walking round and round and round and round, and you can cover quite a distance in one session on one lock, and it can take a long time. Now, I mentioned the communities on the canal are more frequent, shall we say. The ones on the rivers seem to be quite a lot further apart. Now, there's nothing can be done about that. Communities are where communities are, and I suspect it's because the rivers are a natural phenomena by and large, and canals are man-made and tend to be based on people, so carrying commodities. But it does make it a little bit more awkward if you want to find a pub or you want to go and get a loaf of bread. Nothing can be done about it. It just requires a bit more planning, but it's, you know, it was something that I saw as a not a positive, shall we say. One thing that is important and needs to be taken into account by anybody using the rivers, they can be unpredictable. Any extended periods of rain further upstream, and it may not affect you, it may not get anywhere near you, but it could impact the river, and the stream of the river, the flow of the river, can increase quite rapidly, and you can find yourself in a situation where you're stuck in the middle of nowhere on a river that's flowing so quickly that you've just got to moor up and wait. In extreme cases, they can obviously flood, and then you could be in serious problems. So just, if you're ever going onto the rivers, just take those things into account. Similarly, on the canals, no, the canals don't flood, or very rarely, very, very rarely do they flood, but they can run out of water. On my journey back up the Northampton flight, my section of canal ran out of water. Travelling along the Ashby Canal the end of last winter, early spring this year, the canal was very low, so the canals can run out of water, so water is an issue for both things, so that needs to be taken into account. Carrying on the negative, or the less favourable, shall we say, aspects, if the rivers are wide and lacking in boat movement, sometimes the canals can be particularly... Sorry about that, there's somebody joyriding in a helicopter. I wish they'd clear off somewhere else. So, continuing the less positive aspects of river and canal life, I suppose you call it, transport, cruising. I've mentioned leaky locks and the poor maintenance thereof. It's not a criticism as such, because let's face it, the Canal and River Trust is a charity. Their funding has been dramatically cut in the last, or will be dramatically cut in the next 5 years, and that process has already started. So they are really under the pump in terms of finding resources to do the work that's necessary. Now obviously locks are a key part of the infrastructure, but it's still got, the money's still got to be found from somewhere. So if the rivers are wide and spacious and boat movements are not frequent, then on the canals, or at least some of the canals, the opposite is the case. The canals can be really narrow, barely width for two boats to pass, and boat movements seem to be a lot more frequent on the canals, probably because the canals are popular and safe and a great place to be. But with that brings a sense of congestion sometimes. You can be queuing up at locks, you can be queuing up in lots of places to sort of get a passage through through a tunnel, for instance. And having said that services are more frequent on the canals, that is the case, but sometimes you get to a service point and you've got a list of what that service might be, and then you find that some of it is out of order. I've heard a lot of people that travel from the canals down to the rivers, particularly the rivers in the east of England, saying that as you travel along them, for large parts of them, the rivers are embanked and you can't see very far, and you get a sense of almost, not claustrophobia, but something of that ilk. Well, there are banks, they're flood banks along large sections of the Nene and the River Great Ouse, and they're there for a reason. They're to keep the river in, because in some parts the Nene and the Great Ouse are actually higher than the surrounding farmland. If you moor up and get to the top of the bank, you get a fantastic view, but yes, they do have a function. But similarly, on the canals, as you can see behind me, they're lined with hedges for large sections. And often the vegetation grows right in and sometimes over the water. And again, it can be, again, not claustrophobic, but it can close you in. And you get no sense of the landscape you're travelling through. You have to stop, go for a walk to find that out. So whilst, yes, the hedges serve a fantastic ecological purpose, as well as windbreak and everything else, the banks also have a function. So I didn't get a sense of being closed in on the rivers. I don't get a sense of being closed in on the canals, even when the vegetation grows right out over the water. Right, let's get back on the boat and have a cup of tea, shall we? It's getting a bit windy and it's getting a bit cold and a bit overcast out here. I think we might have some rain. Well, cheers everybody. Oh, that's good. Okay, one other, I think, important factor to take into account if you're planning on doing the rivers and canals, particularly if you're going to do them both in the same year, is one of licensing. Now, I heard a lot of comments while I was away down on the rivers from both sides, actually. The people that spend all their time on the river and people that by and large spend their time on the canals but have ventured down onto the river this year. And I hear comments from people that stay on the canals all year round about licence fees. They are expensive, there's no getting away from it, particularly if you are low on resources. Now, I got 3 licences this year. I already had my Canal and River Trust licence. I needed to upgrade that to a gold licence to go down onto the rivers, but then to get between the River Nene and the Great Ouse, I also needed a licence from the middle level commissioners. And yes, it is expensive to get, particularly if you're getting all 3. This might seem a bit controversial and it might not please everybody, but I just want to put it into context, really. I don't know how the Environment Agency is funded. I do know how the middle level's funded. It's funded by the people that pay for drainage. And presumably, I don't know, but they may get a government grant as well. But from a CRT, Canal and River Trust perspective, the amount of money that they get through boating licences is a tiny fraction of what their budget is. I think it's less than 20% of the money they have to manage the system. Now, as we all know, or if you're a boater, you'll already be aware that the CRT over the next 5 years is having its funding cut. So the grant money that it was receiving is no longer going to be accessible. And as the grant money had been paying for replacing leaky lock gates and cutting back vegetation on the towpath and cutting back vegetation on the riverbank, which most people will agree are not in the best condition. But if it's not in the best condition with the funding they have been receiving, it's going to get worse when that funding is cut. So when we start complaining about the cost of river licences or canal licences, just bear in mind that our little drop in the ocean is exactly that. It's a drop in the ocean compared to what the Canal and River Trust have to pay out every year to keep the system going. So I'm not saying that more couldn't be done. There's lots of arguments to get outside funding, to get sponsorship. You know, could the lock gates be sponsored, for instance? Anyway, let's not get into that. That's not what this vlog is about. This vlog is to try and not compare the rivers to canals, but to offer my view on how I found them. So, Which did I find the best? Do I prefer canals or do I prefer rivers? Neither. They've both got positives. They've both got aspects to them that are not as positive. And in a nutshell, I enjoyed myself on the rivers this summer. I enjoy being back on the canal. I enjoyed my time before I left the canal. They are just different beasts. We all know on the canal that you have to plan your time. So where's the water going to be filled up next? Where are you going to get your next loaf of bread? Slightly different planning on the rivers. Yes, you have to work out where your water's coming from, and yes, you have to work out where you're going to get your next loaf of bread. But for me, that was also coupled with the fact, where am I going to stop for a pee next? At my age, you need to pee, a bit more regularly. And if there's nowhere to moor, you need to work out how many cups of tea you can have in the morning before you're going to need to stop an hour, 2 hours later, whatever. So you need slightly different planning. As I say, I enjoyed both. So the overall impressions, well, I think it's a question, and it boils down to two quite simple things really. On the canals, you can go for a couple of hours maybe, or even less if you want, because invariably you will find somewhere to moor up. If you want to stop for lunch, or you want to stop for a pee or a cup of tea or whatever it is, this is all solo boating, don't forget. You can do that on the canals quite readily. On the rivers, your cruises tend to, through necessity, need to be longer. Now, how much longer? It's a piece of string really, because some of the moorings are quite close together, some of the moorings are more distant, but they do tend to be longer. So you have to plan when you're going to have lunch, or if you want to stop for a cup of tea, that has to be taken into account, and using the loo obviously needs to be taken into account. So the only factor that needs to be considered, to my mind, is, do you want the space and a longer cruise, or do you want a little less space but have the flexibility to stop pretty much when you want to? So I don't have a preference. I enjoyed them both. Yes, they both cost, and the difference is quite pronounced, but it boils down to some very simple decisions to make. I'd highly recommend the two rivers that I travelled on this summer, the River Nene and the River Great Ouse. I found it fascinating. I found the space and the time it gave you very enjoyable. Equally, I'm pleased to get back on the canals. Okay, well, that's my views, my opinions on solo boating as a comparison, pros and cons, I suppose, between rivers and canals. So then, that's the end of this one. If you're not already, please subscribe to the channel. It's free, doesn't cost you anything. If you want to know what I'm up to next, then click the notification button. And if you found this interesting or informative, then give us a thumbs up. Okay, till next time, see ya.